Forget everything you think you know about abandoned places. This Ohio jail doesn't just have dark history. It has a terrifying, living protocol. Failed to follow its unspoken commands after dark. And you're not just trespassing. You're volunteering to become another spectral statistic. We brave the midnight shift to uncover the bizarre rules you must obey to survive. Are you brave enough to hear them? The first time I saw Red Marsh County Correctional Facility, the November sky hung low and bruised over its Gothic silhouette, and something in my chest tightened without explanation. The building sprawled across 12 acres of forgotten Ohio farmland like a wounded animal that had crawled there to die, but somehow refused to stop breathing. For stories of crumbling brick and barred windows stared back at me with the hollow judgment of a structure that had witnessed too much human misery to ever truly become lifeless. I never planned to work the midnight shift at an abandoned prison. Nobody plans something like that. Life has a way of making its own arrangements, pushing you toward doors you'd never willingly open. My name is Derek Holloway, and 6 months ago, I was a construction foreman in Columbus with a mortgage, a failing marriage, and the kind of debt that makes you consider desperate options. When my brother-in-law mentioned the Historical Preservation Society needed overnight security for Red Marsh while they processed grant applications, I laughed at first. $75 an hour seemed absurd for watching an empty building. Then I stopped laughing when he told me why the previous guards kept quitting. The facility closed in 1987 following a catastrophic riot that left 17 inmates and 4 corrections officers dead. The official reports called it a containment failure, a breakdown in communication protocols that allowed violence to cascade through the cell blocks like wildfire. But the unofficial stories, the ones whispered in local bars and referenced in faded newspaper clippings at the county library, told a different narrative entirely. They spoke of strange occurrences in the months leading up to the riot, of inmates who reported seeing figures in their cells that didn't belong there, of guards who heard voices giving them commands that made no logical sense, but felt impossible to ignore. What the newspapers never mentioned, what I would only learn through painful firsthand experience, was that the riot didn't really end when the National Guard arrived. Something continued after the bodies were removed and the doors were locked. Something continued even now, 37 years later, occupying the darkness between midnight and dawn with a patience that defied human understanding. My first night was supposed to be a straightforward orientation. Walter Briggs, the facilities manager who'd been with the Historical Society for 2 decades, met me in the gravel parking lot at 11:30. He was a weathered man in his late 60s with the kind of face that suggested he'd seen things he'd never willingly discuss. His handshake was firm but brief, and he avoided my eyes when I asked him about the previous guards. The laminated sheet he pressed into my hands would come to define every moment of my existence at Red Marsh. 12 rules, printed in stark black text against a cream background, with a header that read simply, "Mandatory overnight protocols." I remember laughing when I first scanned them, certain this was some kind of elaborate hazing ritual for the new hire. Walter didn't laugh. He stared at me with something between pity and warning until my smile faded into uncertain silence. I still have that laminated sheet. I've memorized every word, every punctuation mark, every carefully chosen phrase. But that first night, standing in the shadow of those crumbling walls while the November wind carried sounds that might have been distant traffic or might have been something else entirely, I made the mistake of dismissing them as superstitious nonsense. Rule 1 seemed simple enough. Enter only through the main administrative entrance. Never use the inmate processing door on the eastern side, regardless of circumstances. If you find the administrative door locked when you arrive, do not attempt to enter the building that night. Return to your vehicle and drive away without looking back at the structure. Walter walked me through the entrance procedure with the grave precision of a man teaching someone to defuse explosives. The administrative door required a specific sequence. 3 knocks, a 5-second pause, then a single turn of the key counterclockwise before rotating it clockwise to disengage the lock. He demonstrated twice before allowing me to try. When I asked why such an elaborate ritual was necessary for a simple lock, he told me the building needed to know who was entering. I assumed he meant the alarm system. I was wrong. The interior of Red Marsh smelled like mildew, old metal, and something underneath those familiar scents that I couldn't immediately identify. It would take me 3 shifts to recognize that underlying odor as decay that never quite progressed to completion, as if the building existed in a perpetual state of almost death. The administrative wing retained some semblance of its original structure, with a reception desk covered in decades of dust and motivational posters from the 1980s still clinging to water-stained walls. Someone had painted over the windows with thick black paint, which Walter explained was necessary for security purposes. I would later understand the true reason they needed to remain covered. The security station occupied what had once been the warden's office, a surprisingly spacious room with wood-paneled walls and a bank of monitors connected to cameras that captured grainy footage from various locations throughout the facility. Most of the screens showed static, but 4 remained functional. The main entrance, the central corridor junction, the entrance to cell block C, and the prison chapel. Walter insisted those 4 views were the only ones that mattered, that I should focus my attention on them throughout my shift and try to ignore anything I might glimpse in the peripheral screens. What I would soon learn is that Red Marsh operates on its own timeline between the hours of midnight and 5 in the morning. The rules exist because something in this building has existed for far longer than the prison itself, something that absorbed the suffering and violence and desperation of thousands of incarcerated souls until it developed its own consciousness, its own needs, its own methods of adding to its collection. Rule 2 addressed my patrol responsibilities. At exactly 1:15 a.m., you must walk the main corridor from the administrative wing to the junction point, where cell blocks A and B diverge. Walk at a steady pace. Do not stop. Do not look into any cells you pass. If you hear footsteps behind you, maintain your pace exactly. The footsteps will match yours. If they fall out of sync, you have done something wrong. Walter demonstrated the patrol route once, his footsteps echoing against the concrete floor with rhythmic precision. I noticed he kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, never deviating, never acknowledging the cell doors we passed, even when something inside one of them shifted with a sound like fabric dragging across a metal cot. When I asked him about the sound, he pretended not to hear my question. By the time we returned to the security station, his forehead glistened with sweat despite the November chill that permeated every inch of the building. The history of Red Marsh extends beyond the prison itself, reaching back to the land's original purpose. Before the correctional facility was constructed in 1932, this site housed the Red Marsh Sanitarium, a tuberculosis treatment center that operated from 1897 until its closure following a mysterious fire in 1928. Before the sanitarium, the land belonged to the Marsh family, early settlers who established a farming community in the 1840s. 4 generations of Marshes lived and died on this property before the last surviving member, a woman named Abigail Marsh, was found wandering the fields in 1893, speaking in a language no one could identify and describing visitors who came to her in the night with demands she couldn't refuse. The land has always had rules. The structures built upon it have always required protocols. What the prison administrators discovered through trial and error over 55 years of operation, what the guards learned to accept or perish trying to deny, was that Red Marsh doesn't just house the dead. It employs them. Rule 3 would become the first one I truly understood. Between 2 a.m. and 2:47 a.m., you will hear the count. Voices will call out numbers in sequence from somewhere in cell block C. Do not attempt to determine the source. Do not respond. Do not leave the security station until the counting stops. If a number is spoken and then repeated, Immediately say the following number in the sequence aloud. Failure to correct the count has consequences. Walter left me alone at midnight with a thermos of coffee, a flashlight with fresh batteries, and a look on his face that I can only describe as apologetic. He wished me luck, handed me his business card with his personal cell phone number handwritten on the back, and told me to call him immediately if anything felt wrong. Not if anything happened. If anything felt wrong. The distinction I would come to understand was crucial. The building seemed to breathe differently once I was alone in the security station. The monitors flickered occasionally, revealing shifting shadows that the rational part of my brain attributed to old equipment and degraded wiring. The wind outside found cracks in the structure and created sounds that could have been moaning, could have been whispering, could have been anything my imagination chose to manufacture. I focused on the laminated sheet of rules, reading them over and over until the words began to blur together. I was so focused on memorizing the protocols that I almost missed it. Just before 1 a.m, the camera monitoring the chapel entrance captured something that made my breath catch in my throat. A figure stood in the frame, motionless, facing the camera with the still intensity of a mannequin. The image was grainy, the lighting poor, but I could make out enough to recognize the shape of a person wearing what appeared to be the stripe pattern of an old prison uniform. I blinked, convinced I was imagining things. When I opened my eyes, the figure remained. I reached for my phone to call Walter, then stopped when I remembered Rule 7. Do not make phone calls inside the building between midnight and 5 a.m. unless you are reporting your inability to complete your shift. The building listens to conversations. It learns. It adapts. The figure in the chapel camera feed raised one hand slowly, deliberately, and pointed at something beyond the frame. Then the monitor flickered, the image dissolved into static, and when it cleared seconds later, the chapel entrance was empty. That was the moment I should have left. That was the moment every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to grab my jacket and flee to my car and never look back at this crumbling monument to human suffering. But $75 an hour has a way of silencing instincts, and the weight of my debts felt heavier than my fear. I would come to regret that calculation. In the hours that followed, Red Marsh would teach me exactly why its protocols existed, and exactly what waited in the darkness for those who thought they were brave enough to dismiss them. The clock on the wall read 1:14 a.m. In 60 seconds, I would need to begin my first patrol. In 60 seconds, I would walk into the corridor where the footsteps lived, where the cells held occupants that no longer possessed bodies, where the rules were not suggestions, but absolute requirements for survival. In 60 seconds, my real education would begin. The second hand swept past 12, and my legs moved before my brain fully processed the decision. Rule 2 demanded precision, and whatever consequences Walter's terrified expression hinted at, I wasn't willing to discover them on my first night. The security station door creaked open with a sound that seemed to reverberate through the entire wing, announcing my departure to whatever occupied the darkness beyond. The main corridor stretched before me like a throat waiting to swallow. Emergency lights positioned every 30 feet cast pools of sickly yellow illumination that only emphasized the absolute darkness between them. My footsteps echoed against concrete that had absorbed decades of shuffling feet, of desperate last walks, of the rhythmic march of men moving toward fates they couldn't control. The walls pressed close despite the corridor's actual width, creating the sensation of moving through a space that was simultaneously vast and claustrophobic. I kept my gaze fixed forward exactly as Walter had demonstrated, my peripheral vision catching nothing but shadows and the occasional glint of reflected light off cell bar metal. 47 cells lined this stretch of corridor, 23 on each side, plus the isolation unit at the far end. During the prison's operational years, these cells housed inmates awaiting trial, serving short sentences, or being held for transfer to more permanent facilities. Many of those men had walked this same path I now walked, though for reasons vastly different from mine. My footsteps found a natural rhythm, the sound becoming almost hypnotic as I passed the first dozen cells. Then, exactly as the rules had warned, I heard it, another set of footsteps behind me, matching my pace with mechanical precision. The sound was wrong in a way that defied immediate explanation. Too hollow, too deliberate, too perfectly synchronized. My heart rate spiked, but I forced myself to maintain my steady walk, counting my steps to keep my pace consistent. The footsteps followed. Left foot, right foot, the echo of my movements duplicated by something that walked the same corridor without ever appearing in my peripheral vision. I thought about Rule 2's final instruction. If they fall out of sync, you have done something wrong. The implication was clear. As long as the footsteps matched mine, as long as I maintained the protocol, whatever followed me remained bound by rules it couldn't break. The junction point appeared ahead, a crossroads where the corridor split into separate passages leading to cell blocks A and B. I reached it exactly 3 minutes after beginning my patrol, turned left to return by the parallel corridor, and continued my measured walk back toward the administrative wing. The footsteps followed, never faltering, never varying, never revealing their source. I returned to the security station at 1:23 a.m. The moment I crossed the threshold and closed the door behind me, the sound of footsteps simply stopped. Not faded, stopped, as if whatever had followed me couldn't enter this space, as if the security station represented something other than simple walls and a locked door. My hands trembled as I sat down before the monitor bank. The 4 functional screens showed nothing unusual. The chapel entrance remained empty. The main entrance remained sealed. The corridor I had just walked appeared deserted on a grainy camera feed. Cell block C showed only darkness and the suggestion of barred doors stretching into obscurity. Rule 4 addressed the next phase of my shift. At 2 a.m., a door will open somewhere in the building. You will hear it. Do not investigate. The door will close on its own at 2:12 a.m. If it is not closed by 2:13 a.m., you must leave the building immediately using only the administrative entrance. Do not return that night. I checked my watch obsessively as the minutes crawled toward 2 o'clock. The monitor showing cell block C began to exhibit strange behavior, the image occasionally splitting into doubled frames that suggested motion where none should exist. I told myself it was equipment malfunction. I told myself that old cameras in old buildings did strange things for mechanical reasons. I almost believed my own explanations. At exactly 2 a.m., I heard the door. It came from somewhere deep in the building's bowels, a metallic shriek of hinges that hadn't been oiled in decades. The sound carried through the structure with impossible clarity, reaching the security station as if the door had opened immediately outside the window. My skin prickled with the particular terror of knowing something was happening that I couldn't see and wasn't supposed to investigate. The 12 minutes that followed were the longest of my life up to that point. I sat motionless in the warden's old chair, watching the monitors, listening to the silence that had replaced the door's opening shriek. Occasionally, I heard something else. Shuffling, movement, the suggestion of voices conversing at volumes just below my ability to comprehend words. The sounds came from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls themselves, from the floor beneath my feet, from some dimension adjacent to the one I occupied. At 2:12 a.m., the door slammed shut. The sound was even louder than its opening, a thunderous boom that rattled the monitors and sent dust cascading from the ceiling. I checked my watch with frantic precision. 2:12 and 47 seconds a.m. The protocol had held. Whatever the door represented, whatever it had admitted or released during those 12 minutes, had retreated according to schedule. But I had barely caught my breath before Rule 3 activated. The count began at 2:14 a.m., earlier than the protocol had specified. Voices emerged from the monitor speakers, from the walls, from the very air I breathed. They called numbers in sequence, their tones flat and mechanical like recordings played at slightly wrong speeds. 1, 2, 3, 4. The counting continued, each number spoken by a different voice. Male voices, female voices, voices that defied gender identification, voices that sounded like they emerged from throats no longer attached to living bodies. I gripped the arms of my chair, remembering the protocol's instruction. Do not respond unless a number is repeated. 15, 16, 17, 18. I counted along silently, tracking the sequence, preparing myself for the possibility that a number might repeat. The voices continued without apparent source or location, filling the security station with their monotonous recitation. 23, 24, 25, 25. My throat constricted. The protocol was clear. I had to speak the next number. I had to correct the count. My voice emerged as a whisper at first, barely audible even to my own ears. I forced volume into my words, speaking as clearly as my terror allowed. 26. The counting stopped. 3 heartbeats. Absolute silence filled the security station. Then the voices resumed, picking up from 27, as if my correction had been expected, as if my participation was simply another step in a ritual that had been performed countless times before. The count reached 147 before it ended. 147 voices had spoken, 147 numbers had been called, and I had corrected the sequence twice more when numbers repeated. Each time, my voice felt smaller against the weight of the ritual. Each time, the silence that followed my correction felt longer, heavier, more pregnant with attention. I learned something crucial in those 47 minutes. The protocols weren't arbitrary. They represented a negotiation, a carefully constructed agreement between the living and whatever inhabited Red Marsh after dark. The rules existed because something on the other side of perception had agreed to follow them, had agreed to limit its behavior in exchange for specific acknowledgments from those who entered its territory. Breaking the rules didn't just mean danger. Breaking the rules meant violating a contract that kept the darkness contained. Rule 5 addressed my responsibilities between 3 a.m. and 3:45 a.m. During this period, you may hear your name spoken from somewhere in the building. Do not acknowledge it. Do not respond. The voice will attempt variations. It may sound like someone you know. It may sound like a child. It may sound like someone in distress. Do not acknowledge it under any circumstances. If you respond, it will know you can hear it. If it knows you can hear it, it will not stop. I checked the employee file Walter had given me. My name appeared nowhere in the documentation. All security personnel were identified by badge numbers only. The Historical Society had learned this lesson through experience, through guards who responded to voices calling names that shouldn't have been known, through empty positions that needed to be filled after previous occupants simply stopped showing up for their shifts. At 3:07 a.m., I heard it, a voice from somewhere in the corridor outside the security station, speaking a name that was not mine, but was close enough to make me hesitate. Dennis. The voice was male, raspy, desperate. It called the name twice more, then fell silent. I exhaled slowly, grateful for the protocol, grateful for the warning that had prevented me from responding to what might have been a test. But the voice returned at 3:15 a.m., and this time it spoke my actual name. Derek. The sound crawled through my ear and wrapped around my spine like frozen fingers. How could it know? The documentation used only numbers. No one in the building should have known my name. Yet the voice spoke it with the casual familiarity of someone who had known me for years, someone who had read my name countless times, someone who had been listening and learning despite all precautions. Derek, the voice called again. Please help me. I'm trapped. I'm in the chapel. Please, Derek. My hand moved toward the door handle before I caught myself. The voice had changed, becoming female, becoming younger, becoming something that sounded remarkably like my teenage daughter calling for her father. My daughter who lived with her mother in Cincinnati. My daughter who had no reason to be in this building, who couldn't possibly be here, who was being impersonated by something that had learned exactly which vocal patterns would make me want to abandon the protocols. I closed my eyes and recited Rule 5 silently. Do not acknowledge it. Do not respond. If you respond, it will know you can hear it. If it knows you can hear it, it will not stop. The voice called for 23 more minutes. It cycled through variations that nearly broke me. It sounded like my mother who had passed away 4 years ago. It sounded like my brother who lived in Texas. It sounded like colleagues and childhood friends and strangers who all knew my name and all needed my help and all existed only as weapons designed to make me violate the protocol. At 3:45 a.m. exactly, the voice stopped mid-word. The silence that followed felt like a reset, like the building was recalibrating for the next phase of whatever ritual governed its nighttime existence. Rule 6 covered the period from 3:45 a.m. to 4:30 a.m. This is the quiet hour. Nothing will attempt to contact you. Nothing will move. Use this time to rest if needed, but do not fall asleep. If you fall asleep during the quiet hour, you may not wake up in the same place you fell asleep. You may not wake up at all. I used the quiet hour to drink lukewarm coffee and read the remaining rules on the laminated sheet. Each one described scenarios that seemed impossible, encounters that defied rational explanation, consequences that ranged from unsettling to fatal. Rule 7's warning about phone calls. Rule 8's instructions regarding what to do if I saw myself on one of the monitors. Rule 9's prohibition against entering any cell, regardless of what I might see inside. Rules 10, 11, and 12 concern the final half hour of the shift, the period between 4:30 a.m. and 5 a.m. when the building would attempt its most aggressive tactics to keep me inside. According to the laminated sheet, this was when the protocols became most critical, when any deviation from the prescribed behaviors could result in outcomes from which there was no recovery. But those rules would have to wait for another night. My first shift was nearly over, and all I wanted was to escape this place with my sanity and my soul intact. At 4:47 a.m., something began scratching at the security station door. The sound was rhythmic, insistent, like fingernails dragging across wood in a pattern that almost resembled communication. I stared at the door, watching it tremble slightly with each scratch, wondering what waited on the other side, and knowing with absolute certainty that I could not open it until the clock read 5 o'clock. 13 minutes. 13 minutes until I could leave. 13 minutes until I could return to a world where the rules of physics applied consistently, and where voices didn't call names they shouldn't know. The scratching continued, and something told me that whatever made that sound was counting down the same minutes I was waiting for the moment when the protocols would change and new possibilities would emerge. 13 minutes felt like 13 hours, but I held the rules close. I did not open that door. 3 weeks passed before I encountered cell block C directly. The rules had kept me confined to specific routes, specific areas, specific windows of time when movement was permitted. But on my 19th shift, Rule 11 activated for the first time, and I understood why the laminated sheet described that particular protocol in language that bordered on pleading. Rule 11 read as follows. On certain nights, the monitor for cell block C will display a green light in the upper right corner. When this occurs, you must enter cell block C between 4 a.m. and 4:15 a.m. Walk to the 7th cell on the left side. You will find an envelope on the floor just inside the bars. Take the envelope. Do not open it. Do not read its contents. Leave cell block C immediately and place the envelope in the iron box beneath the reception desk. If you fail to retrieve the envelope, you will find it waiting for you at your home when you return. The green light appeared at 3:47 a.m., a small emerald glow in the corner of a monitor that had shown nothing but darkness and static for nearly 3 weeks. My stomach dropped when I saw it, my mind racing through the implications of what I would have to do. Cell Block C was the deepest part of the facility, the maximum security wing where the most violent offenders had been housed during the prison's operational years. It was also where 17 of the riot's casualties had occurred, where the walls still bore stains that cleaning crews had never been able to remove. I prepared myself as thoroughly as I could. Fresh batteries and the flashlight, a clear path memorized through the corridors, a focused mind that refused to acknowledge the fear screaming through every nerve in my body. At 4:02 a.m., I left the security station and began the journey towards Cell Block C. The route took me past areas I had only glimpsed on monitors, past corridors that seemed to stretch and compress, depending on how directly I looked at them, past cell doors that stood open despite having been locked for 37 years. The smell intensified as I moved deeper into the building, that underlying odor of almost decay becoming more pronounced, more aggressive, more present. The entrance to Cell Block C was a steel door that should have been impossible to open without the original key mechanism, which had been destroyed during the riot. Yet the door stood ajar when I arrived, a 6-inch gap that beckoned me forward with silent insistence. I pushed it open and stepped into the cell block proper. The space was different from the corridors I had walked during my patrols, where those passages felt abandoned, but stable. Cell Block C felt occupied. The air moved differently here, carrying currents that suggested breathing from multiple sources. The darkness seemed thicker, more resistant to the beam of my flashlight. The cells lining both walls contained shadows that shifted in ways that had nothing to do with the movement of my light. I counted cells as I walked. 1, 2, 3, 4. Something moved in cell 5. I caught the motion in my peripheral vision, but remembered the rules about looking into cells. Keep your gaze forward. Do not stop. Do not investigate. The movement continued, a shape rising from what might have been a cot, turning toward the bars with the slow deliberation of something that had waited a very long time for someone to notice. 5, 6, 7. The 7th cell on the left appeared in my flashlight beam, and I saw the envelope immediately. It lay on the concrete floor, just inside the bars, a white rectangle that seemed to glow faintly against the decades of accumulated filth. I knelt down, reaching through the bars just far enough to grasp the envelope's edge. Try not to think about how close my hand was to whatever occupied the cell during the hours I wasn't present. My fingers touched paper, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. The cold was aggressive, penetrating, the kind of cold that felt personal rather than environmental. I grabbed the envelope and pulled my hand back, already rising to my feet, already turning to retreat. But something caught my attention, a sound from deeper in the cell block. Not the familiar sounds of the building settling or the wind finding cracks in the structure. This was a voice, clear and distinct, speaking words I couldn't quite understand but somehow recognized as language. Then another voice joined it, then another, then dozens. The inmates of Cell Block C were waking up. I ran. The protocol demanded steady movement, demanded controlled behavior, but the protocol hadn't prepared me for the cacophony that erupted from every cell I passed. Voices calling out in languages I didn't recognize, in phrases that sounded like pleas and accusations and demands. Hands reaching through bars, visible now that my flashlight beam swung wildly with my sprinting motion. Faces pressed against metal. Faces that were wrong in ways my brain refused to process. Faces that had been dead for 37 years but had never stopped watching. I burst through the Cell Block C entrance, slammed the door behind me, and ran through the corridors without any consideration for protocols or proper pace. The envelope crumpled slightly in my grip as I sprinted, but I didn't stop until I reached the security station and locked myself inside. The iron box beneath the reception desk was exactly where the rules said it would be, a small container that looked far too simple for its apparent purpose. I deposited the envelope without looking at it, without allowing my curiosity to override the explicit instruction against reading its contents. The lid of the box felt warm when I closed it, as if the envelope had carried heat from wherever it had originated. I collapsed in the warden's old chair and tried to control my breathing. The monitors showed nothing unusual. The corridor I had just fled appeared empty. Cell Block C's camera displayed only darkness and the occasional flicker of static. But I had seen them. I had seen the inmates who never left. And I understood now why the protocols existed, why the rules had been crafted with such specific language and such urgent warnings. Red Marsh didn't just contain spirits. It contained a population, a community of something that had once been human, but had transformed through decades of imprisonment in a place where death was merely a change in circumstance rather than an ending. The following week brought new revelations. I began to recognize patterns in the building's behavior, predictable rhythms that the protocols had attempted to describe, but that only became clear through direct experience. The door at 2 a.m. opened onto different spaces, depending on the night. The count at 2:14 a.m. varied in length based on criteria I couldn't identify. The quiet hour was sometimes interrupted by sounds that the rules hadn't anticipated, sounds that required improvised protocols and desperate guesses about proper responses. Walter visited the facility every third day, arriving at 6 a.m. to check on the building and review whatever incidents I had documented. He listened to my reports with the weary acceptance of someone who had heard similar accounts many times before. When I asked him how long the protocols had been in place, he told me they had been developing since the prison's closure, each rule added in response to events that had claimed previous guards. The original security team had consisted of 12 people. They had discovered many of the rules through trial and error, through nights when someone did something the building didn't like and paid an immediate price. 4 of those original guards had simply disappeared during their shifts, their cars found in the parking lot, but their bodies never located. 2 had been found inside the building after their shift should have ended, their eyes open and their faces frozen in expressions that suggested they had seen something that exceeded human tolerance for fear. The remaining 6 had quit within the first year, their resignation letters describing experiences they refused to elaborate upon. Walter himself had worked the midnight shift for 3 years before transitioning to a management role. He had seen things that had changed his understanding of reality in fundamental ways. He had learned that Red Marsh wasn't haunted in any conventional sense. It was something else, something that defied the vocabulary of paranormal investigation. The building was alive. Not alive like a plant or an animal. Not alive in any biological sense. Alive in the way that a city is alive. A collection of elements that had developed their own consciousness through the sheer accumulation of human experience. Every prisoner who had walked these corridors, every guard who had maintained order, every victim of the riot and the years of violence that preceded it, they had all contributed something to the collective awareness that now governed Red Marsh after dark. The protocols were rules of engagement with that consciousness. They were boundaries that the living had established with whatever the building had become. Agreements forged through sacrifice and suffering and the desperate creativity of people trying to survive in a place that regarded them as potential additions rather than temporary visitors. Rule 8 became relevant on my 27th night. The rule stated, if you see yourself on one of the monitors, do not look at the screen directly. Use your peripheral vision only. The image will attempt to make eye contact. If you establish eye contact with the image, it will be able to see through your eyes for the duration of your shift. At the end of your shift, what it has seen will not leave with you. I noticed the figure on the monitor for Cell Block C at 3:33 a.m. It stood in the corridor, wearing my jacket, my flashlight visible in its hand. The camera angle made it difficult to see the face clearly, but the posture was unmistakably mine. The specific way I held my shoulders, the particular tilt of my head when I was concentrating. I looked away immediately, remembering the rule, using only my peripheral vision to track the figure's movements. It walked slowly down the cell block corridor, approaching cell after cell, pausing at each one as if searching for something or someone. The figure stopped at cell 7, the same cell where I had retrieved the envelope. It turned toward the camera, and even through peripheral vision, I could see it raising its hand, pointing directly at the lens, directly at me. The monitor flickered. When the image stabilized, the figure was gone. But something had changed in the security station. The air felt different, heavier, as if additional presence had entered the room without using the door. I sat motionless for the remainder of the quiet hour, sensing something watching from just beyond the edge of my perception, something that wore my face and had been denied access to my eyes. The protocols had held, this time, but I was beginning to understand that survival at Red Marsh wasn't guaranteed by following the rules. The rules merely improved the odds. They were defensive measures against something that had infinite patience and unlimited time to find new approaches, new vulnerabilities, new ways to add to its collection. The prisoners of Red Marsh County Correctional Facility had served their sentences long ago, but their imprisonment had never ended. And whatever had taken root in this building was constantly looking for new inmates to join them. I was beginning to wonder if my employment was actually security work, or if I was simply merchandise that hadn't been processed yet. Tyler Brennan was the new hire who would teach me exactly what happened when the protocols failed. He arrived on a Tuesday in late January, a young man barely 23, with the cocky confidence of someone who had never encountered a situation he couldn't handle. The Historical Society had assigned him to shadow me for a week before beginning his own solo shifts. And from the moment I met him, I knew he was going to be a problem. He dismissed the laminated sheet of rules with a laugh that echoed too loudly in the parking lot. He asked questions designed to demonstrate his skepticism rather than to gather information. He made comments about haunted house nonsense and elaborate pranks that made me want to grab him by the shoulders and shake sense into his dismissive young brain. On his third night of training, Tyler broke Rule 2. We had reached the junction point during the 1:15 a.m. patrol, the footsteps following behind us exactly as they always did. I had explained the protocol carefully, demonstrated the proper pace, emphasized the critical importance of not stopping and not looking back. Tyler had nodded with the performative attention of someone who wasn't really listening. He stopped walking. The footsteps behind us stopped exactly 1 beat later. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs as I processed what had just happened. Tyler turned to face the corridor behind us, that arrogant smile still plastered across his face, looking for evidence to disprove what I'd told him. "There's nothing back there," he said. "Just echo from our own footsteps. Watch." He took a step backward, toward whatever had been following us. The temperature in the corridor dropped so rapidly that my exhaled breath became visible mist. The overhead emergency lights flickered, each one dimming in sequence from the junction point toward the administrative wing, as if something was moving through the electrical system with deliberate speed. Tyler's smile faltered for the first time. He took another step backward, and I saw movement behind him. Not a shadow, not a trick of the failing light. A figure, solid enough to have form, transparent enough to reveal the cell doors beyond it, close enough that I could see details I would never be able to forget. The figure wore a corrections officer uniform from an era decades past. Its face was visible but wrong. Features that existed in the right configuration, but with proportions that suggested something not quite human was wearing a human mask. Its eyes were the worst part. They reflected no light, absorbed no shadow, simply existed as voids in a face that was otherwise complete. Tyler must have seen my expression change because he finally stopped moving backward, but he didn't turn around. The cocky confidence that had defined every moment of his behavior seemed to evaporate in an instant, replaced by the primal terror of prey sensing a predator. "What's behind me?" His voice was barely a whisper. I couldn't answer. The protocol hadn't covered this situation. The laminated sheet described what to do if the footsteps fell out of sync, but it said nothing about what happened when someone stopped walking entirely, when someone turned to face what followed, when someone took steps backward into the presence of something that hadn't been directly observed in 37 years. The figure moved, not walked, moved. It covered the distance between itself and Tyler in a motion that happened too quickly for my eyes to track. One moment, it stood 5 feet behind him. The next moment, it was directly at his back, its head tilted at an impossible angle, its void eyes fixed on me over Tyler's shoulder. Tyler screamed. The sound wasn't the startled yelp of someone frightened. It was the scream of someone experiencing something beyond fear, beyond pain, beyond any emotion that has a name. His body went rigid, every muscle locking simultaneously, his eyes rolling back until only the whites were visible. The figure wrapped its arms around Tyler from behind, an embrace that looked almost gentle if you ignored the context. Tyler stopped screaming. His mouth remained open, but no sound emerged. The figure began to sink through the floor, dragging Tyler with it, their forms becoming translucent as they descended through concrete that should have been solid. I lunged forward, grabbing Tyler's wrist before he disappeared entirely. The figure's void eyes turned to me, and I felt something brush against my mind. Not thoughts, not communication, something older and colder, something that recognized me with the casual interest of a predator assessing potential prey. The contact lasted less than a second before I released Tyler's wrist involuntarily. My hand had gone numb, the nerves simply refusing to maintain connection with whatever I had touched. Tyler sank through the floor with the figure still embracing him, his face visible for one final moment before both of them vanished entirely. The corridor returned to its normal temperature. The emergency lights stabilized. The footsteps did not resume. I stood alone at the junction point, staring at the floor where Tyler Brennan had disappeared, understanding for the first time exactly what the protocols protected against. The security station offered no comfort that night. I sat before the monitors in a state of shock, watching the cameras for any sign of Tyler, knowing I wouldn't find him, knowing that whatever had taken him existed in spaces the cameras couldn't capture. At 2 a.m., the door opened somewhere in the building. At 2:14 a.m., the count began. At 3:07 a.m., a voice called Tyler's name from the corridor outside the security station. Not my name, Tyler's name, as if the building was already processing him, already incorporating him into whatever population existed within its walls. I completed my shift. I followed the remaining protocols with mechanical precision. When 5 a.m. arrived and I fled to my car, I didn't look back at the building. I couldn't. Walter called me at noon that day. He already knew. Somehow, he already knew exactly what had happened and exactly who was responsible. The Historical Society would conduct an investigation, he said, though we both understood no investigation would produce answers. Tyler Brennan would be reported as having left his shift early without notification. His car would be found in the parking lot. His body would never be located. I should have quit that day. I should have walked away from Red Marsh and never returned. But something kept me anchored to that job, something beyond the financial desperation that had originally led me there. I had witnessed something that defied every assumption I had ever made about reality. I had seen the protocols fail, and I had survived. The question that would haunt me for the remainder of my employment was why. Why had the figure released me when I touched it? Why had I been allowed to witness Tyler's disappearance without suffering the same fate? Why did the building continue to tolerate my presence when it had just demonstrated its willingness to claim those who violated its rules? The answer came 3 nights later, in the form of a new rule that hadn't appeared on the original laminated sheet. Walter met me in the parking lot before my shift began. His face showed the strain of sleepless nights and conversations he didn't want to have. He handed me a new laminated card, smaller than the original sheet, containing a single additional protocol. Rule 13. If you are spared when another is taken, you have been marked. The building has accepted your presence. Your shifts will become longer. Your protocols will become more complex. You are now responsible for maintaining the agreement. Welcome to the permanent staff. I stare at the card, understanding flooding through me like ice water through veins. The previous guards hadn't quit or disappeared. Some of them had been promoted. Some of them had become part of the building's operational structure, human representatives maintaining the boundary between the living world and whatever Red Marsh had become. I had been promoted. The shift that night lasted until 7 a.m. instead of 5 a.m. New protocols activated that I had never encountered before. The building showed me areas that hadn't appeared on any map, corridors that existed only during specific hours, cells that contained inhabitants I could now see clearly. The inmates who never left weren't monsters. They were trapped. They were men and women who had died in this place, whose spirits couldn't escape whatever consciousness had developed within these walls. They looked at me with eyes that held desperate hope, mouths moving in silent pleas I couldn't quite understand. And the corrections officer figure that had taken Tyler appeared again, not as a predator, but as something closer to a colleague. It stood at the end of cell block C, watching me retrieve another envelope from the 7th cell, making no move to approach or threaten. I was part of Red Marsh now. I was responsible for maintaining the protocols, for ensuring the boundary held, for preventing whatever existed inside this building from spreading beyond its walls. The question I couldn't answer was whether I was being protected or imprisoned. The distinction seemed less clear with each passing night. 8 months after Tyler's disappearance, I began to plan my escape. The word itself felt wrong in my mouth, too dramatic for a situation that had become my everyday reality. But that's exactly what I was planning. Escape. Flight. A desperate attempt to sever the connection between myself and Red Marsh County Correctional Facility before the building decided I was more useful as a permanent resident than a living caretaker. The protocols had consumed my life. What had started as a simple security job had transformed into something that resembled priesthood more than employment. I knew secrets about the building that no one else knew. I could navigate its impossible geography during the hours when reality became negotiable. I had conversations with entities that had been dead for decades, translating their needs into actions that maintained the delicate equilibrium, keeping Red Marsh contained. But I was dying. Not physically, though my body showed signs of deterioration that doctors couldn't explain. Something essential was draining away, night by night, shift by shift. The building was feeding on me, slowly absorbing whatever quality made me useful, preparing to take the final portion when my usefulness expired. I found the answer in the envelopes. 117 envelopes had passed through my hands over 8 months, each one retrieved from Cell 7 in Cell Block C, each one deposited in the iron box beneath the reception desk without being opened. The protocol had been explicit. Do not read the contents. The protocol had been absolute. But protocols, I had learned, could be renegotiated. On my 243rd night, I opened an envelope. The paper inside was handwritten, the penmanship elegant but shaky, the words forming sentences that read like entries in a journal. March 14th, 1952. The warden has approved my transfer to solitary. I welcome the isolation. The things I see in the general population cells have become unbearable. Faces that shift when unobserved. Voices that speak in languages that shouldn't exist. The chaplain tells me to pray, but I suspect whatever inhabits this place predates the gods we've invented. I've begun documenting what I observe, hoping someone will eventually understand. The building is not haunted. The building is hungry, and it is patient. The entry continued for 3 pages, describing events from 72 years ago that matched exactly what I had experienced. The writer, an inmate named Franklin Pierce Davenport, had been housed at Red Marsh during its early decades. He had witnessed the building's consciousness developing, had documented its growing awareness, had attempted to warn the administration about what they were nurturing through decades of human suffering concentrated in one location. The final paragraph of the entry offered something I hadn't expected. Instructions. If you are reading this, you have been chosen. The building has marked you, claimed you, begun the process of absorption. You can feel it happening. The exhaustion, the detachment, the sense that your own memories are becoming less solid while the building's history becomes more present in your mind. There is a way to escape, but it requires breaking every protocol simultaneously. The building's control depends on the living following rules. If all rules are broken at once, the building's attention fragments. It cannot maintain its grip on someone who refuses all negotiation. But you must be complete in your refusal. Any adherence to any rule will allow it to maintain its hold. Complete rejection, complete freedom, or complete absorption. Those are your only options. I read the entry 3 more times, committing every word to memory. Then I burned the paper and began planning. The preparation took 2 weeks. I needed to map every rule, every protocol, every unwritten agreement that governed behavior at Red Marsh. I needed to identify a single moment when I could violate all of them simultaneously, when my refusal would be absolute and undeniable. I chose the last night of February, the anniversary of a riot that had killed 21 people and transformed Red Marsh from a prison into a prison for prisons. The building's attention would be focused on the anniversary, on the memory of violence that had fed its consciousness more than any other event. It would be distracted. It would be vulnerable. I arrived at 11:30 p.m., as usual, parking in my designated spot, approaching the administrative entrance with the laminated sheets tucked into my pocket. The night was cold and clear, stars visible through gaps in the clouds, moonlight casting shadows that seemed more defined than usual. At 11:58 p.m., I broke Rule 1. I walked past the administrative entrance and approached the inmate processing door on the eastern side, the door that should never be used, the door that provided direct access to the heart of the building's consciousness. The door was unlocked. It had been waiting for me. I entered without knocking, without pausing, without any of the rituals that were supposed to notify the building of my presence. The corridor beyond was darker than any I'd walked before, the emergency lights absent, the darkness absolute except for a faint phosphorescence that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. At 12:01 a.m., I broke Rule 2. I stopped walking. I turned around. I looked directly into the darkness behind me and saw the figure that had followed every patrol for 8 months. The corrections officer with the void eyes. The entity that had taken Tyler Brennan and countless others before him. It looked back at me with something that might have been surprise. I refuse, I said aloud. I refuse all protocols. I refuse all agreements. I refuse everything this building has asked of me. The temperature dropped. The walls began to move, contracting inward like the throat of some impossible creature. Voices erupted from every cell, every corridor, every space within the building, screaming and pleading and threatening in languages that spanned centuries. I kept walking toward the eastern door rather than away from it. Rule after rule shattered with each step. I spoke during hours when silence was required. I looked into cells and saw the faces of inmates who had never left. I answered when voices called my name. I opened doors that were supposed to remain closed. I touched surfaces that protocols forbade contact with. The building's consciousness turned its full attention toward me, and I felt its weight like a physical force. It pressed against my mind, demanding compliance, threatening consequences, offering bargains I could barely comprehend. Power beyond anything I had imagined. Understanding of the universe's hidden structures. Eternal existence within walls that contained eternity. I refused everything. The eastern door appeared ahead of me, closer than it should have been, as if the building's geography was collapsing in response to my rejection. I reached for the handle, knowing that crossing this threshold would sever the connection permanently, would release me from whatever claim Red Marsh had established over my soul. The corrections officer figure appeared directly in my path, its void eyes fixed on mine, its arms outstretched to block my escape. "You cannot leave," it said. Its voice was layered, dozens of tones speaking simultaneously, the accumulated voices of everyone it had ever consumed. "You are part of us now. You belong to this place." I looked directly into its void eyes, feeling the vertigo of gazing into infinite emptiness. For a moment, I saw what it offered: peace, an end to struggle, an eternal existence free from the chaos and pain of living. Then I remembered everyone it had taken: Tyler Brennan, the original guards, the inmates who had never escaped, the countless souls absorbed over a century of hungry patience. "No," I said. "I don't." I stepped forward, directly through the figure's extended arms, directly through its incorporeal form. The sensation was indescribable, cold and heat simultaneously, existence and void intertwined. The accumulated weight of a century of suffering passing through my body in a single instant. I reached the eastern door and pushed it open. Sunlight flooded the corridor. Impossible sunlight from a sky that should have been dark for another 5 hours. The building screamed behind me, every voice it contained crying out in fury and desperation. The walls continued to contract, reaching for me, trying to pull me back before I crossed the threshold. I stepped outside, and the door slammed shut behind me with finality that echoed across the empty fields surrounding Red Marsh County Correctional Facility. The building fell silent. The screaming stopped. The consciousness that had inhabited those walls for over a century was still present, still aware, but it could no longer reach me. I had broken every rule. I had refused every negotiation. I had escaped. The sun hung in a sky that logic insisted should be dark, and I understood that time moved differently around Red Marsh, that my escape had somehow carried me forward through hours that should have taken their natural course. It was 7:23 a.m. according to my watch. My shift had ended over 2 hours ago. I walked to my car on legs that trembled with exhaustion and relief. The building watched me through its barred windows, its consciousness pressing against the barrier of my complete refusal, unable to cross the threshold it had once controlled. I never went back. The Historical Society sent letters, then phone calls, then a formal termination notice. I ignored all of it. Red Marsh would find another caretaker, another human interface to maintain its protocols, another soul to slowly absorb over months and years of incremental submission. But it wouldn't be me. The nightmares continued for a while. Dreams of corridors that stretched forever, of footsteps that matched my own, of voices calling names I tried to forget. The connection hadn't severed completely. Some fragment of Red Marsh had crossed the threshold with me. A splinter of its consciousness lodged in my memory, like shrapnel from an explosion. But each night, the dreams became fainter. Each morning, I woke with a clearer sense of who I was and what I had survived. The building's grip was weakening, its claim eroding in the face of my continued refusal to acknowledge its authority. I moved to Oregon 3 months later, as far from Ohio as I could get while remaining in the continental United States. The distance helped. The mountains helped. The ocean, when I could see it from the coastal highways, reminded me that the world was larger than any building, older than any consciousness that fed on human suffering. Sometimes I still hear the count, faintly, usually around 2:14 a.m., numbers called in sequence by voices I almost recognize. I never respond. I never acknowledge. I maintain my refusal, night after night, until the voices fade and silence returns. Red Marsh County Correctional Facility still stands, still waits, still hungry after all these years. Someone else walks its corridors now, follows its protocols, feeds its endless appetite for human connection and human surrender. I hope they read the envelopes. I hope they find Franklin Pierce Davenport's instructions. I hope they understand, before it's too late, that the only escape from Red Marsh is complete and total rejection of everything it offers. The building cannot hold someone who refuses to be held. That's the final rule, the one that never appeared on any laminated sheet, the one that the building never wanted anyone to discover. You can escape the nightmare, but only if you're willing to break absolutely everything. The end.